She stepped into the wrong elevator by mistake. What she didn't know was that the men already inside ruled the city shadows with a silencer and a smile. One floor was enough to seal her fate, because Moon Jung never lets a witness walk away. The heavy humidity of the city clung to Brianna Davis like a second skin as she fumbled with her security badge outside the elevator bank of the Sapphire Towers. Her shoulders ached from the grueling double shift, and the straps of her overstuffed backpack dug into her collarbones, a constant reminder of the stable life she was killing herself to build. She'd finally landed the junior executive role, her first taste of a world that didn't involve hourly wages and bus transfers. The elevator call button glowed a steady, mocking white. "Come on," she whispered, shifting her weight as the doors finally slid open with a soft, expensive chime. She stepped inside without looking up, her thumb hovering over the button for the 24th floor. The doors sealed shut, locking out the noise of the lobby. The air inside smelled of expensive sandalwood and something sharp, metallic, a scent her instincts flagged instantly as wrong. She was reaching for the panel when the lights didn't just flicker, they died. The elevator jerked violently, a mechanical scream echoing in the shaft before it ground to a shuddering halt. A crimson glow flooded the small space. Emergency lock. Brianna froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She reached for the alarm, but a voice cut through the red-tinted darkness like a jagged blade. "Don't." The voice was male, calm, with an accent that wrapped around the English word like silk over cold steel. Korean, she realized, though it carried an authority that made disobedience feel like a terminal mistake. The backup lights hummed to life, dim and atmospheric. A man stood in the opposite corner, leaning casually against the mirrored wall as though he'd been waiting for exactly this catastrophe. He was devastatingly beautiful in the way a storm is beautiful just before it breaks. Sharp jawline, dark eyes that assessed her with a predatory, quiet intelligence, and black hair swept back from a face that looked carved from marble. He wore a crisp white dress shirt rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms marked with intricate, dark tattoos that coiled down to his wrists. And in his right hand, a handgun rested loosely, pointed at the floor. "I." Brianna's voice came out as a fractured croak. She swallowed hard. "I think I'm in the wrong elevator." "You think?" His lips curved into a ghost of a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. He tilted his head, studying her with the focus of a man who made his living reading the secrets people tried to hide. "Or you know." "I definitely know now," she whispered, her eyes locked on the steel in his hand. "Knowledge is a dangerous thing, Brianna," he murmured, using a name he shouldn't have known. He turned the gun over in his hand, examining the barrel as if it were a work of art. The doors weren't opening. And looking into Moon Jung's eyes, Brianna realized the elevator wasn't the only thing that was locked down. The heavy, rhythmic thrum of the Sapphire Tower's lobby faded behind Brianna as she crossed the threshold of the elevator bank. It was that peculiar hour of the evening when the city's ambition and its exhaustion collided. The air smelled of floor wax and the lingering ozone of 1,000 passing bodies. Her backpack felt like a leaden weight against her spine, the straps digging into the bruised muscles of her shoulders, but she barely noticed the pain. She was floating on the clinical high of a 14-hour shift, her mind already navigating the path to her front door, a hot shower, and the sweet, dark mercy of sleep. The elevator on the far left pinged, a deep, resonant sound that felt more like a warning than a welcome. The doors slid open with a whisper of expensive hydraulics, revealing a car lined in brushed obsidian and smoked glass. Brianna stepped inside, her eyes fixed on the glowing floor indicator, her thumb hovering habitually over the button for 24. She didn't look to the side. She didn't notice that the interior of this particular car lacked the standard directory of offices or the peeling, no smoking sticker of the others. She was an outsider in this world of glass and steel, a woman who had fought for every inch of her stable life, and she was too tired to see the signs of a territory she wasn't meant to enter. The doors sealed with a heavy, pressurized thud, cutting off the ambient noise of the world outside. The silence that rushed in was immediate and absolute, broken only by the soft, rhythmic ticking of a high-end watch. As the car began its ascent, the floor beneath her feet felt unnervingly smooth, lacking the slight vibration of a standard lift. Brianna shifted her weight, a sudden, cold prickle of intuition crawling up the back of her neck. The air in the enclosed space was different, colder, filtered through a scent that didn't belong in a corporate building. It was the smell of old sandalwood, expensive leather, and a faint, sharp undertone of something acrid, like the ghost of a spent match. She finally looked up, her gaze drifting toward the mirrored wall to her right. For a heartbeat, she saw only her own reflection, tired eyes, messy curls, and the defensive hunch of her shoulders. But then, as the elevator passed the 10th floor, the light caught a silhouette in the opposite corner. A man was standing there, his presence so still he could have been a statue. He was leaning casually against the glass, his arms crossed over a white dress shirt that looked bright enough to blind. In that one terrifying moment of realization, Brianna's breath hitched. She hadn't just taken the wrong elevator. She had stepped into a private, pressurized cage with a ghost who hadn't made a sound. She went to reach for the keypad, her fingers trembling, but the floor beneath her jerked with a violent, metallic scream. Gravity vanished for a split second, and the numbers on the display didn't just stop, they flickered out into a void of red. The transition from motion to stillness was not a stop, it was a violent interruption of reality. The elevator car didn't merely halt, it shuddered with a deep, visceral groan of protesting steel that Brianna felt in the very marrow of her bones. A heavy, industrial clunk echoed from the shaft above, followed by the terrifying whine of a safety brake biting into the rails. Gravity surged, then vanished, leaving her stomach somewhere in the vicinity of her throat. Before she could scream, the overhead light surged with a blinding, artificial brilliance, and then died. The darkness that rushed in was absolute for only a heartbeat before the emergency system kicked in. A low, rhythmic hum filled the small space as the control panel bled a sickly, pulsating red. Emergency lock. The words glowed on the small LED screen, casting long, distorted shadows against the mirrored walls. The air, once cool and filtered, suddenly felt heavy and thin, as if the elevator had exhaled its last breath. Brianna stumbled, her backpack sliding off her shoulder and hitting the floor with a muffled thud. Her fingers scrambled for the control panel, pressing the open button with a frantic, rhythmic desperation that bordered on prayer. Nothing. She hit the alarm, expecting a piercing siren, but only a hollow, electric click answered her. The silence of the sapphire towers was now a predatory thing, sealing her in a glass and steel tomb suspended 20 stories above the concrete. "Hello," she called out, her voice cracking, the sound small and fragile in the vast, metallic quiet. "Is anyone there? I'm trapped, please." The elevator stopped. She turned toward the doors, her hands flat against the cold obsidian surface, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches that fogged the glass. She was so focused on the exit that she had almost convinced herself she was alone. But as the red emergency light pulsed again, she saw it, a reflection in the smoked glass that didn't belong to her. The man in the corner hadn't flinched. While she had been a whirlwind of panicked motion, he had remained a statue of terrifying composure. In the crimson strobing of the lockdown, he looked less like a businessman and more like a myth made of shadow and bone. He didn't reach for the panel. He didn't call for help. He simply watched her, his dark eyes tracking the frantic rise and fall of her chest with a calm, clinical detachment that made the hair on her arms stand up. The lockdown was total. The doors weren't opening, the phones were dead, and the most feared man in the city was measuring her fear like a scientist. Brianna realized then that the elevator stopping wasn't the disaster. It was the introduction. The emergency lights continued their slow, rhythmic pulse, bathing the elevator in a heartbeat of crimson. Every time the light ebbed, the men in the corner seemed to dissolve into the shadows, only to re-emerge more vivid and more dangerous with the next surge of red. Brianna's breath was a jagged, audible stutter in the silence. She backed away from the dead control panel, her spine hitting the glass wall opposite him. The coldness of the surface seeped through her thin blouse, but it was nothing compared to the chill radiating from the figure across the car. He hadn't moved a muscle since the safety brakes had locked. He stood with his weight centered, a relaxed dominance in his posture that suggested this wasn't an accident for him, it was merely a change in venue. His white dress shirt was stark against the dark paneling, the sleeves rolled back to reveal forearms corded with lean muscle. In the strobing light, the tattoos curling around his skin looked like living shadows, ancient and intricate, disappearing beneath the cuffs of a world that pretended men like him didn't exist. Moon Jung didn't look like a man trapped, he looked like a man who owned the air she was currently struggling to breathe. His eyes were the most terrifying part. They weren't filled with the frantic adrenaline of a survivor. They were dark, bottomless pools of predatory intelligence that watched her with a calm, unblinking focus. He wasn't assessing her for help, he was reading the frantic pulse in her neck, the way her fingers clawed at the straps of her backpack, and the precise moment her terror turned into a realization of who he was. The scent of sandalwood and gun oil grew heavier in the confined space, a masculine, lethal cologne that felt like a physical weight. Brianna realized then that the elevator wasn't just a box of steel and glass anymore, it was a confessional. And the man standing in the corner was the only God who was listening. "You're trembling," he said. The voice was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to travel through the floor and up into her bones. It was smooth, like expensive whiskey, but carried an edge of sharpened steel. It wasn't a question or an observation of concern, it was a statement of fact, a hunter noting the shiver of a deer. Brianna tried to swallow, but her throat was a desert. She wanted to look away, to find a corner of the ceiling or the floor to anchor her gaze, but his presence was a gravitational pull. She was caught in the orbit of a man whose name was whispered in the city's darkest corners as a warning. The silence between them grew, thick and suffocating, until the only thing left in the world was the red glow of the emergency lock and the terrifying weight of his attention. He didn't have to touch her to make her feel the bars of the cage. He just had to be there. The fear was no longer a sudden spike of adrenaline, it had settled into a heavy, cold liquid that filled Brianna's lungs. In the rhythmic pulse of the emergency lights, the elevator felt like it was shrinking, the obsidian walls pressing inward to crush the air out of her. Every time the red glow surged, it caught the dull, matte finish of the handgun resting in Moon Jung's hand. He wasn't pointing it at her, not yet, but its presence was a silent shout in the enclosed space. She tried to control her breathing, mindful of the predatory intelligence watching her, but her lungs betrayed her with a sharp, audible hitch. The sound felt deafening in the vacuum of the lockdown. I don't have anything, she whispered, the words fracturing as they left her throat. She gripped the straps of her backpack until her knuckles turned white, a pathetic shield against a man who clearly dealt in lives, not pocket change. I'm just a junior executive. I was just trying to go home. Moon Jung didn't answer immediately. He pushed off from the wall, the movement so fluid and silent it was as if he were made of smoke. He took a single, slow step toward the center of the car. Brianna's back hit the glass with a dull thud, her eyes darting to the floor, the ceiling, anywhere but that unreadable face. The fear wasn't just about the gun. It was the absolute, terrifying certainty that she was an anomaly in his world, a witness to a man who lived by the rule that witnesses were liabilities. She could feel the heat of him now, a stark contrast to the chilled, recycled air of the elevator. The scent of sandalwood and something sharper, like spent gunpowder, was a physical weight on her chest. You think I'm here for your backpack, Brianna? His voice rumbled, closer now, vibrating through the small space. The fact that he knew her name sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. He hadn't checked her ID, he hadn't asked. He simply knew. That was the true face of the fear, the realization that for men like Moon Jung, there were no coincidences, only targets and collateral. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the cold press of steel or the sudden, final darkness. The silence stretched, agonizing and thick, until the only thing she could hear was the frantic, panicked drumming of her own heart against her ribs. She was a bird caught in a high-altitude cage, and the predator wasn't even hungry, he was just curious how long it would take for her to stop flapping her wings. The silence in the elevator was no longer empty, it was a heavy, pressurized thing that demanded an answer. Moon Jung didn't move to strike or to brandish the weapon, instead, he simply stood in the center of the crimson-soaked car, his presence filling the space until the air felt too thick for Brianna to swallow. Look at me, he commanded. It wasn't a shout. It was a low, resonant vibration that pulled at her chin like an invisible wire. Brianna forced her eyes upward, her vision blurred by the prickle of unshed tears. She met his gaze, obsidian and bottomless, and felt the sheer weight of his scrutiny. He wasn't just looking at her, he was dissecting her, peeling back the layers of her terrified junior executive mask to see the raw nerves beneath. Why this building, Brianna? Why today? I work here, she gasped, the words stumbling over her dry tongue. The 24th floor. Marketing. I just started 2 months ago. I'm nobody. Nobody takes the gold-keyed service lift by accident, he murmured, taking a slow, predatory step closer. The scent of sandalwood and gun oil was overwhelming now, a masculine, lethal fog. Unless they were sent. Unless they were told exactly when the security grid would flicker. I didn't know, she cried, her voice cracking against the glass wall. The lights were dim, the doors were open. I was just so tired. I didn't even look at the panel. Please, I just wanted to go home. Moon Jung tilted his head, his dark hair catching the red strobing of the emergency light. He studied the frantic pulse in her neck, the way her fingers clawed at her backpack as if it could save her. His jaw was tight, a ridge of muscle jumping in his cheek as he measured the sincerity of her terror. In his world, innocence was a myth used by the clever to hide their tracks, but the girl in front of him wasn't clever. She was shattered. He reached out, his hand moving with a terrifying, fluid speed. Brianna flinched, squeezing her eyes shut as she braced for the impact, but his fingers only brushed the strap of her bag, sliding upward until they rested just below her jaw. His skin was warm, a startling contrast to the chilled air of the elevator, and his touch was surprisingly steady. "You're either the best actress I've ever seen," he whispered, his face inches from hers, "or you are the unluckiest soul in this city." He didn't pull away. He stayed in her personal space, his thumb tracing the frantic line of her heartbeat. The interrogation wasn't about the words she spoke, it was about the way her body reacted to his proximity. He was looking for the lie in her blood, and for the first time since the doors had sealed, the predatory edge in his eyes shifted into something else, a dark, unsettled curiosity. The red emergency light pulsed, a slow, rhythmic heartbeat that seemed to synchronize with the silence between them. Brianna's breath was a thin, trembling wire, her eyes locked on Moon Jung's as his thumb remained anchored against her jaw. The terror was still there, a cold weight in her stomach, but the sharp, jagged edge of it began to blunt. In the suffocating proximity, she realized he wasn't moving to strike. He was simply existing in her space, his intensity shifting from that of a predator to an observer. The hand resting near her throat didn't tighten. Instead, his fingers trailed upward, brushing the edge of her backpack strap with a touch so light it was almost a ghost of a sensation. Moon Jung's expression remained a mask of marble, but the predatory stillness in his eyes fractured. He wasn't looking at her as a witness to be silenced anymore, he was looking at her as a person, a fragile, exhausted intruder who had stumbled into a war she didn't understand. "You're still shaking," he murmured, his voice dropping into a register that felt less like a threat and more like a secret. "I'm terrified," Brianna whispered, the honesty of it cracking her voice. She didn't try to hide it anymore. The mask of the junior executive had been discarded on the elevator floor along with her pride. "I'm terrified of you. I'm terrified of this box. I just want to go back to my life." Moon Jung's jaw tensed, a ridge of muscle jumping beneath the skin. He looked down at the handgun in his other hand, then, with a fluid, dismissive motion, he engaged the safety and tucked the weapon into the waistband of his trousers. The lethal silhouette was gone, replaced by a man in a rumpled white shirt who looked suddenly, jarringly human in the strobing light. The atmospheric pressure in the elevator shifted. The dangerous stranger was still there, but the Mafia boss had stepped back. He didn't move away, but the iron grip of his presence loosened just enough for Brianna to take a full, shaky breath. He watched her for a long moment, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone before he finally withdrew his hand. "Your life," he repeated, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. He leaned back against the mirrored wall, his posture relaxing into a dark, brooding grace. "Tell me about this life that is worth so much fear, Brianna." It wasn't an interrogation anymore. It was an opening. The elevator was still locked, the lights were still red, and they were still trapped 20 stories above the world, but the danger had changed shape. As Brianna looked at him, she realized the most terrifying part of the night wasn't the gun or the lockdown, it was the fact that the man who should have been her ending was suddenly interested in her beginning. The red glow of the emergency panel pulsed like a dying star, but the air in the elevator had shifted from a vacuum of terror to something heavy, warm, and inexplicably intimate. Brianna leaned her head back against the cool glass, her legs finally giving up their fight to stay rigid. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her backpack pulled into her lap like a shield. Moon Jung didn't remain standing over her. With a fluid, feline grace, he sank down to the floor as well, crossing his long legs and resting his tattooed forearms on his knees. In the dim, strobing light, the monster of the city's nightmares looked like nothing more than a man weary of his own shadow. "My life." Brianna started, her voice a small, fragile thread in the dark. "It's small. It's quiet. I wake up at 5 to beat the rush. I drink lukewarm coffee and worry about spreadsheets. I'm trying to save enough to move my mother closer to the city so she doesn't have to work the night shifts anymore." She looked at him, expecting a smirk or a dismissive shrug, but Moon Jung's gaze was anchored to hers. He wasn't looking at her as a distraction, he was listening as if her mundane struggles were a language he had forgotten how to speak. "It sounds stable," he murmured. The word was heavy, coated in a layer of envy so thin it was almost invisible. "It's safe," she corrected, her fingers tracing a stray thread on her bag. Or it was. Until the doors closed. "Safety is an illusion, Brianna. It's just a room you haven't been kicked out of yet." He leaned his head back, his dark hair catching the crimson light. "My life is a series of rooms where everyone is waiting for the lights to go out so they can find my throat. I don't remember the last time I sat on a floor and talked about coffee." For a heartbeat, the silence wasn't a threat. It was a bridge. In the belly of the sapphire towers, suspended between the heaven of the elites and the hell of the streets, two people who should have never met found a strange, jagged alignment. Brianna saw the fatigue behind his predatory mask, and Moon Jung saw a fire in her that the corporate world hadn't quite managed to extinguish. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had evolved into a shared, electric tension. She realized that while she was trapped in this box with him, he was trapped in a life that allowed no exits. As their eyes met in the rhythmic pulse of the red light, the distance between the junior executive and the Mafia boss vanished, replaced by a connection forged in the one thing they both understood: the sheer, exhausting cost of survival. The intimate bubble of their shared confessions was shattered not by a sound, but by a sudden, violent return of the world beyond the glass. The elevator car groaned, a deep, tectonic shift of metal that vibrated through the floor and into Brianna's spine. The red emergency glow flickered once, twice, and then died, replaced by a harsh, clinical surge of overhead LED panels. The transition from the soft, crimson shadows to the unforgiving white light was a physical blow. Brianna squinted, her hand flying up to shield her eyes, but Moon Jung was already on his feet. The vulnerable man who had sat on the floor talking about coffee vanished in the span of a heartbeat. As he stood, he smoothed his white shirt with a single, sharp motion, the fabric snapping back into place over his tattooed forearms. The Moon Jung the city whispered about had returned. He didn't look at her as the elevator began a slow, smooth descent. His gaze was fixed on the floor indicator, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. The warmth that had pulsed between them in the dark was sucked out of the air, replaced by a sterile, freezing professionalism. Brianna scrambled to her feet, clutching her backpack to her chest, feeling suddenly exposed in the bright light. "You shouldn't have been in here, Brianna," he said, his voice stripped of the low, melodic vibration from before. It was flat, resonant, and final. "I know," she whispered, her heart starting its frantic drumbeat again. "I told you, it was a mistake. There are no mistakes in this building tonight." He turned his head just enough to catch her eye in the mirrored wall. The dark irises were no longer searching, they were deciding. The grid didn't flicker because of a storm. It was cut. They were looking for me. The weight of the reveal hit her like a physical impact. The lockdown hadn't been a malfunction. It had been an ambush. And she had spent the last hour bonding with the target. "Who?" she breathed, her voice barely a ghost. Moon Jung didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his waistband and pulled the handgun back out, checking the chamber with a practiced, metallic click that sounded like a door closing forever. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a split second, the cold mask slipped. A shadow of regret, or perhaps a warning, flickered in his eyes. "When those doors open," he murmured, stepping toward the center of the car, "you run. You don't look back, you don't call for help, and you forget every word we spoke in the dark. If you don't, the life you're trying so hard to build won't just be safe, it will be over." The elevator chimed, a cheerful, mocking sound that announced their arrival at the lobby. The doors began to slide apart, revealing a wall of black-clad men with leveled weapons and the cold, professional chaos of a war zone. The reveal was complete. Brianna Davis wasn't just a girl in the wrong elevator anymore. She was the only thing standing between the most feared man alive and the end of his world. The elevator doors didn't just open, they retreated like a curtain pulled back from a firing line. The lobby of the Sapphire Towers, usually a sanctuary of muted jazz and expensive marble, had been transformed into a cold, tactical vacuum. A dozen men in slate-gray tactical gear stood in a semicircle, their suppressed rifles leveled with a terrifying, synchronized precision. The air that rushed into the car was no longer recycled and stale, it was charged with the electric, metallic scent of an imminent storm. Moon Jung didn't flinch. He stepped into the threshold, his silhouette a sharp, white-shirt defiant blade against the dark arsenal waiting for him. He didn't look back, but his presence remained an anchored weight in Brianna's peripheral vision. He was a shield she hadn't asked for, standing between her and the abyss of his own world. "Stand down," a voice barked, not from the guards, but from a man shadowed near the obsidian reception desk. The rifles dipped, a wave of disciplined steel lowering in unison. Brianna's heart was a frantic, trapped thing, drumming against her ribs so hard it made her vision blur. She felt the sudden, dizzying rush of the release, the physical sensation of the cage opening, but her feet remained rooted to the elevator floor. The safety of the box, however terrifying, was a known variable. The lobby was a war zone she wasn't equipped to survive. Moon Jung turned his head just enough for her to see the hard, frozen line of his jaw. "Go," he commanded, the word low and resonant, vibrating through the marble floor. "Now, Brianna." She didn't run at first, she stumbled. Her backpack felt like a leaden anchor as she lurched past him, her shoulder nearly brushing his. For a fraction of a second, the scent of sandalwood and gun oil flared, a final, sensory reminder of the men who had sat on the floor and talked about coffee. She expected a hand to grab her, a bullet to stop her, or a voice to call her back into the dark. Instead, there was only the sound of her own frantic breathing and the rhythmic slap of her sneakers against the polished stone. She burst through the semicircle of armed men, their masked faces tracking her with a cold, robotic indifference. She was a ghost to them, a piece of debris blown out of the elevator by the force of their master's will. She hit the revolving glass doors, the cool night air of the city striking her face like a physical blow. She didn't look back. She didn't look at the black SUVs idling at the curb or the tinted windows reflecting the neon glow of the skyline. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs turned to water, the bright, clinical light of the sapphire towers fading behind her. She was released, cast back into the safe world she had prayed for, but as she reached the subway entrance, she felt a hollow, aching chill. The doors had opened, but the silence of the elevator had followed her into the night. The safety of Brianna's apartment felt like a lie. The peeling wallpaper and the familiar hum of her outdated refrigerator, which had once been the anchors of her stable life, now seemed like flimsy stage props. She sat on her sofa, her backpack still clutched in her lap, watching the city skyline through her window. From this distance, the sapphire towers were just a glittering needle of glass, beautiful and cold, betraying nothing of the war she had witnessed within its ribs. She tried to return to the rhythm of her safe world. She brewed the lukewarm coffee she had described to him, but the steam didn't smell like home anymore. It smelled like a pale imitation of sandalwood and gun oil. She closed her eyes, trying to summon the spreadsheets and the deadlines that usually consumed her thoughts, but all she could see was the red strobe of the emergency lock and the way Moon Jung's thumb had felt against her jaw. The pull was a physical sensation, a low-frequency vibration in her marrow that made her skin feel too tight. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a tether. She had been released, but she hadn't been let go. Every shadow in her hallway now looked like a silhouette in a white dress shirt, and every sudden noise made her heart bolt like a trapped bird. She realized with a sickening jolt that she was mourning the silence of the elevator. In that pressurized box, for 1 hour, she hadn't been a junior executive struggling to survive a corporate ladder, she had been a woman seen by a man who understood the weight of the world. The world outside felt thin, plastic, and profoundly quiet. 3 days later, the pull became a reality. Brianna was leaving her apartment for the morning commute, her keys already in her hand, when she saw it. A black sedan was idling at the curb, its tinted windows as opaque as obsidian. It shouldn't have meant anything, this was a city of black cars, but the air around it seemed to fracture with the same predatory stillness she had felt 20 stories up. The rear door opened just an inch. No one stepped out. No one called her name. It was an invitation written in shadow. Brianna stood frozen on the sidewalk, her normal life stretching out before her in a series of subway stations and fluorescent lights. She could walk away. She could go to work, file her reports, and spend the rest of her life wondering if the men on the elevator floor had been a dream or a ghost. But as she looked at the car, she felt the tether snap taut. The trap hadn't been the elevator. The trap was the realization that once you've been seen by the dark, the light is never bright enough again. Her feet moved before her mind could protest, drawing her toward the obsidian door and the men who had promised her a world she should fear. The interior of the sedan was a silent, leather-scented vault that instantly severed Brianna from the sounds of the morning street. As the door clicked shut, the city outside, the honking taxis, the rushing commuters, the smell of exhaust, became a distant, muted film strip. Here, the air was chilled to a precise, artificial crispness, and the faint, familiar scent of sandalwood settled over her like a shroud. She didn't have to look to the side to know he was there. The atmospheric pressure in the car shifted the moment she sat down, that same gravitational pull from the elevator car returning with a vengeance. Moon Jung sat in the far corner of the wide bench seat, his silhouette a sharp contrast against the passing city lights. He wasn't wearing the rumpled shirt from the lockdown, he was dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like armor, his dark hair swept back with lethal precision. He didn't turn to greet her. He simply stared ahead at the privacy partition, his jaw set in a line of hard, uncompromising marble. "You shouldn't have gotten in," he said. His voice was a low vibration, a rumble that seemed to travel through the leather upholstery and into her skin. "You shouldn't have opened the door," Brianna countered, her own voice sounding surprisingly steady despite the frantic drumming of her pulse. The collision wasn't physical, it was the sudden, violent merging of two worlds that were never meant to touch. Brianna, with her spreadsheets and her subway passes, was sitting inches away from a man who moved the tectonic plates of the city's underworld. She felt the absurdity of it, the junior executive and the ghost, and yet, as the car glided through a red light without slowing, she realized the normal world was already receding into an unreachable distance. Moon Jung finally turned his head. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and filled with a predatory focus that made her breath hitch. He reached out, his hand moving with that same fluid, terrifying speed she remembered. This time, he didn't touch her jaw. He rested his hand on the seat between them, his fingers inches from her own. The tattoos on his wrist peeked out from beneath his silk cuff, a reminder of the darkness he carried. "I tried to let you go, Brianna," he murmured, the words sounding like a confession and a warning all at once. "I gave you the exit. I gave you the night. But you're still here." "I couldn't forget," she admitted, the honesty of it a spark in the dim interior. "Then you've made your choice." He didn't pull away. Instead, his pinky finger brushed against hers, a light, electric contact that felt more dangerous than the handgun he'd held in the elevator. In that small, charged space, the collision was final. The safety of the shore was gone, and as the car accelerated toward the heart of the district he ruled, Brianna realized she wasn't just a passenger. She was becoming part of the storm. The car didn't stop at her office. It swept past the familiar glass entrance of the Sapphire Towers, turning toward the private docks where the city's skyline met the dark, churning mouth of the harbor. The morning sun was a cold, distant disk, casting long shadows across the leather interior of the sedan. Brianna watched her reflection in the tinted window. The girl who worried about spreadsheets was a ghost, pale and flickering against the obsidian glass. Moon Jung finally broke the silence as the car slowed to a halt. He didn't reach for the door. He turned fully toward her, his presence expanding to fill every inch of the pressurized cabin. The charcoal of his suit seemed to absorb the light, leaving only the sharp, predatory intensity of his eyes. "This is the last threshold, Brianna," he said, his voice dropping into that low, resonant vibration that made her heart bolt. "Beyond this door, there is no marketing firm. There are no safe shifts. There is only me, and the world that tries to tear me apart every hour of every day." He reached out, his hand hovering over the door handle, but he didn't pull it. He was giving her the one thing his world rarely offered, a choice. "If you step out of this car with me," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the pulse fluttering in her neck, "you are no longer a witness. You are a participant. My enemies will become yours. My shadows will become your home. I cannot promise you a stable life, but I can promise you will never be invisible again." Brianna looked at the door, then back at the men who had sat on a cold elevator floor and seen the fire behind her fear. Her safe life was a series of lukewarm coffees and quiet despairs, a slow fading into the background of a city that didn't care if she lived or died. The man in front of her was a storm, a lethal and beautiful disaster, but in his orbit, she felt more alive than she had in 24 years of playing it safe. The choice wasn't between safety and danger, it was between existing and living. She reached out, her fingers trembling only slightly as she placed her hand over his on the door handle. The contact was electric, a collision of soft skin and scarred, tattooed knuckles. She felt the iron strength of him, the absolute certainty of his protection, and the terrifying cost of his claim. "I'm done with safe," she whispered, her voice steadying as she met his gaze. Moon Jung's eyes darkened, a flicker of something that might have been respect, or hunger, igniting in the black depths. He didn't smile, but the tension in his jaw eased just a fraction. He pulled the handle, and the door swung open to a world of salt air, idling engines, and a future that had no map. Brianna stepped out into the wind, leaving the girl with the backpack behind in the shadows of the car, and followed the most feared men alive into the beautiful, violent unknown. The air outside the car tasted of salt and gasoline, a sharp, bracing contrast to the sterile sandalwood of the interior. Brianna stood on the edge of the pier, the wind whipping her hair across her face, watching the sunlight fracture against the dark water of the harbor. Behind her, the door of the sedan remained open, a black maw that felt less like a vehicle and more like a portal. She had spent every moment since the elevator doors opened believing that the world outside was the finish line, the place where the pressure would equalize and the fear would finally evaporate. She was wrong. Escaping the elevator hadn't been an exit, it had been a shedding of skin. As she looked at the row of black-clad men standing in silent formation by the gangplank of a sleek, obsidian yacht, she realized that freedom was an architectural illusion. The Sapphire Towers had been a cage of glass, but the city itself was just a larger enclosure, and Moon Jung was the one who held the keys to every gate. She turned to look at him as he stepped out of the car, his movements possessing a terrifying, unhurried grace. In the harsh light of day, he didn't look like a ghost anymore. He looked like an inevitability. The tattoos on his forearms seemed to pulse in the daylight, dark ink etched into the skin of a man who had never known a life without walls. He didn't have to grab her arm or command her to move. The tether she had felt in her apartment was now a visible weight, pulling her toward him with the same absolute force as the safety brakes in the elevator shaft. "You're looking back," he murmured, his voice cutting through the sound of the waves. "I'm looking at what I left behind," Brianna replied, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. It was stronger, colder, stripped of the frantic hum of the junior executive. "Nothing is left behind," Moon Jung said, stepping close enough that his shadow swallowed her own. "It is simply consumed. That is the nature of this world." She realized then that some doors don't open outward to a wide, limitless horizon. Some doors, once breached, function like a vacuum, pulling you deeper into the center of the storm. The elevator hadn't been a trap, it was a beckoning. Every step she took away from her old life was a step into a deeper, more profound confinement, one built of silk, steel, and the terrifying protection of the men standing beside her. As she followed him toward the yacht, the city skyline began to blur, a distant memory of a girl who once thought safety was found in spreadsheets and subway passes. Brianna didn't fight the pull. She walked into the dark heart of his world, finally understanding that the only thing more dangerous than being trapped with Moon Jung was the realization that she no longer wanted to be free. The human heart is a creature of habit, conditioned to see every shadow as a threat and every closed door as a tomb. For years, Brianna had allowed her fear to act as a sentry, a hypervigilant guard that kept her life small, predictable, and profoundly lonely. She had believed that by avoiding the edge, she was staying safe, never realizing that the walls she built to keep the danger out were the same ones that kept her potential from ever breathing. Fear can protect, serving as the biological alarm that keeps a person alive, but it is a jealous protector. Left unchecked, it will limit the horizon until the world is nothing more than a series of well-trodden paths and quiet compromises. As she stood on the deck of the yacht, the shore receding into a hazy line of glass and gray, she understood that not all danger is a destructive force. Some fires don't aim to consume the house, they exist to burn away the rot in the wood. Moon Jung was a dangerous man, a storm of violence and unspoken debts, but in the crucible of that elevator, he had offered her something her safe life never could, the chance to be seen without a mask. The danger he represented wasn't meant to destroy her, but to dismantle the version of her that was too afraid to truly exist. True growth is rarely a gentle process of blooming, it is a violent, necessary expansion that requires stepping into a dark, echoing unknown. It is the willingness to trade the comfort of a familiar cage for the terrifying freedom of the abyss. Brianna looked at her hands, the hands of a girl who had spent her life clinging to backpacks and security badges, and saw them steadying, ready to grasp the cold, hard reality of a world built on power and loyalty. She had been a witness to her own life, a passenger in a routine she had mistaken for destiny. But the unknown wasn't a void, it was a canvas. By choosing the storm over the shore, she had reclaimed the right to define her own limits. She watched the wake of the boat churn the water into white foam, a physical manifestation of the path she was carving through the silence. The girl who entered the wrong elevator was gone, replaced by a woman who realized that the most dangerous thing in the world wasn't a mafia boss or a locked room, it was the decision to stay small when the shadows were calling you to grow. The descent into his world was just the beginning of her ascent into her own.